Hello, and welcome to my channel, Reading Little Blue Books Out Loud. This is a little blue book. It happens to be Little Blue Book number 1699, and it is entitled The Socialist Goal, written by Fred Henderson. And this is copyright 1931. So, this is the Socialist Goal according to 1931. And we left off at the top of page 11. This is part 2. And we begin a new chapter, Inadequacy of Distribution. The problem of abundant production has been solved. But quite obviously, the problem of distribution has not been solved with it. In a world thus equipped for ample production, the masses of the people remain poor, great armies of them to the point of utter resourcelessness. Drudgery, deprivations, and life-corroding insecurity remain the apportioned lot of a majority of mankind. We can produce, but we are not permitted to consume. Why? To get the answer to that question, it is necessary to take another brief, backward glance at the facts of history. There is a very true saying among scientists that to see things become is the best way to explain them. Let us try to see this maladjustment between our distributive economics and our abundant producing capacity and resources in its process of becoming. And I think we shall not only explain the understanding it, but see clearly how it can be righted. There is one point about it, however, that we shall do well to get clearly into our minds, by way of preliminary. Our producing powers depend upon natural laws, but our distributive arrangements are our own artifices entirely. In what we can produce, we are limited and conditioned absolutely by the powers and resources which exist in nature, and we can apply our human effort to shaping, fashioning, evoking, and utilizing them only within the limits of natural law. But the distribution of the wealth so produced is subject to no law other than the exercise of human common sense and the application of the principles of fairness and justice. If we lived in a poor world, our poverty would be inevitable and incurable. Whatever afflictions we might suffer because of the natural limitations of our producing powers, or the natural scarcity of materials, we should have to grin and bear them. But we need not suffer for a moment longer than we choose deprivations for which our distributive arrangements are responsible. Whatever can be produced can be distributed. Distributed. Well, I'm going to have trouble with that word. Distributed. If we can produce lavishly, we can consume and enjoy lavishly. It is all a matter of human arrangement. And if wealth produced lavishly does not get into distribution, or our production itself is kept down below our producing capacity because of the checks put upon the distribution of supplies, that is not because we are under any disability of natural law preventing its distribution, but because our arrangements for its distribution are stupid and defective. It is very necessary to emphasize this, because if you pursue your studies into these problems, you will find it constantly suggested by the defenders of the vested interest in the existing order that there are inexorable laws of political economy, which debar us from distributing what we produce, and even from producing up to our capacity and according to our needs. You will find on examination that every such promulgation of what purports to be an economic law begins by taking the existing class basis of distribution for granted, and then goes on to demonstrate that certain consequences follow inevitably from it. Most assuredly they do, but what follows from that, if the consequences are humanly undesirable, is not that we are under the necessity of submitting to them, but that to rid ourselves of them we have to challenge the class basis of distribution from which they derive their logic. You may take it as an axiom with regard to distribution that whatever can be produced can be distributed, and that the world is under no obligation of economic law whatsoever to accept and submit itself to the artificial scarcity and deprivations of a defective distributive system. And a distributive system is defective if it fails to supply human life up to the measure of human ability to produce. That the world's wealth cannot be got into the world's life is a proposition contrary to reason and sanity. Having got that preliminary point well into our minds, let us return to our attempt to explain and understand the present maladjustment between our producing capacity and our distributive economics by seeing it in the process of becoming. In the long centuries of the age of necessary human drudgery, poverty was the natural lot of mankind. So far as the human knowledge of its resources and powers were concerned, it was a poor world, and hard and incessant toil could not produce supplies for more than a hard and bare life. Economic equality would not have lifted the community out of that condition. It would only have been an equity of drudgery and small rations. But human life has always felt the urge towards other qualities and satisfactions than are possible under universal drudgery. And although the servitude of men to their bodily wants in a poor world kept them in a condition of drudgery, this urge towards other satisfactions found its expression. Some release of human life into leisure and wealth and opportunity was necessary for the development of a human type other than a drudge. And although the scantiness of the world's available resources made that release impossible for the general life of the community, it was possible for the few. Such are the primitive fertilities of nature, that even in an age of merely primitive knowledge of the surface resources of the world, the labor of a man, working with only the most primitive implements and with no power but the exercise of his own bodily strength, could nevertheless produce something more than the bare needs of his own maintenance. And if a way could be found by which that surplus, too much under such conditions to provide for any general release from drudgery, if spread over the general life, could be concentrated in the possession of a few, a class release into a wider kind of life was possible. There was, of course, an obvious way, obvious enough to the more masterful type of man, the way of enslaving his fellow men. All the slaveries in human history have been their origin in this revolt of the more masterful and aggressive men from having to participate in the common lot of incessant drudgery, and in the fact that the poverty of the world left no way open for successful escape other than the way of appropriating this surplus from the labor of other men. With the then poverty of human resources, only such a restricted class release was possible. And since all the wealth on which all men live is the product of human effort applied to natural resources, the economic form which such a class release into leisure and opportunity took was the seizure into private ownership of the natural resources of the world, which in the drudge age of mankind mainly meant land ownership. The sparse return to be secured by peasant labor from the direct tilling of the soil being practically all that men knew in those days, of what science has now revealed to us as the prodigal bounty of nature available for our satisfactions. This seizure of natural resources into private ownership was the effective enslavement of men, for the ownership of the natural resources of the world is the ownership of all men's opportunities to produce and to live, and with the community's opportunities to live seized into such ownership, all producing opportunity necessarily becomes service to the owner, with rights to him over all the product and consequent power to appropriate to himself all the surplus beyond bare maintenance to those rendering the service. This distributive system of bare maintenance for the general working life of the community and the surplus for a privileged few, enforceable through the ownership by those few of the community's opportunities to live, was the device of a world of scanty resources for securing any human release at all into a life other than mere animal drudgery. In its origins and in its long stability as the basis of the master and the serf form of human society, it was directly related to the fact of the general scantiness of human resources. It was the desperate expedient of robbery legalized and exalted into a social and economic system, by which resources insufficient to go around with any results beyond universal drudgery were made available for the development of qualities and outlooks on life which would otherwise have been kept submerged. And it endured without any real menace to its stability so long as the basic conditions of man's struggle with nature for sustenance remained unchanged as conditions of scanty output and incessant toil, as in fact they did remain until the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution a century or two ago. That age of scanty resources and a natural compulsion upon mankind to drudge incessantly for a bare living is now a thing of the past, with the new gigantic powers of our service and command mastered and effectively harnessed for the task of supplying our needs on a vast scale, so vast a scale that every hour of human effort we devote to setting them to their task and supervising them in the process of production, we get a volume of supplies greater than the output of hundreds of hours of our old human drudgery. Pardon me. Drink. With all this, we have entered upon a new period of human history, a new period of which the resounding note is plenty. More and more supplies of every kind, with less and less human labor needed in producing them. A period in which human poverty is an anachronism and human drudgery is a bare living, a satire on the world's intelligence. There is no longer any natural reason why any human want should go unsupplied, or any human life be without its ample satisfactions. But there is the artificial barrier of the distributive system, which we have inherited from the world's age of penury. It was inevitable that these distributive arrangements, imposed as they were upon the lives of men by the forces operating in an age of scarcity, should survive for a time, for you cannot have a new social order ready-made beforehand for the reception of new factors and the conditions of the human struggle for sustenance, the coming and effect of which could not be foreseen or prepared for. Such new forces naturally make their appearance within the social order then existing, and it is only when their incongruity with the old distributive arrangements becomes manifest and all the discomforts and confusions of a period of social maladjustment that the pressure for new arrangements suited to the new facts become urgent. New chapter. Conflict of economic forces. From the moment of the appearance of these new powers and resources in the producing economy of human life, the stability of the old social order has been menaced by increasing confusions. The tensions of an immense conflict of purpose within our civilization have become more and more apparent. Irreconcilable forces straining against one another and threatening the social order with disruption. The nature of this antagonism between the new producing forces and the old distributive system should now be clear enough. The old class ownership methods of the age of penury have remained without any essential change, and have continued to function in this new world of plenty, for their original purpose of keeping the working life of the community at simple maintenance and passing on the surplus to ownership. It is the essential nature of private ownership of the community's opportunities to produce and to live that it should so function. That it is the end to which it works and for which it is expressly designed. But it is an end hopelessly incompatible with the purposes of human life implicit in the world's new powers of production. For what purpose can a sane world possibly have in abundant production other than the purpose of abundant life for itself? An age for abounding plenty for all cannot be cramped down to the class usage and made to serve the class privileges of a feudal structure of society without setting up a war of purposes in human life. A new producing system, which has changed the possibilities of life from poverty to abundance, needs for its effective working new distributive arrangements to correspond with the new facts. New arrangements which will enable its abundance to become full life for the people of the world. And the whole purpose of the feudal system of private ownership is that the abundance should still be retained as a class prerequisite and endowment. Our present world distresses, our industrial and commercial troubles, may seem very complex to you, but they are essentially quite simple. They are the strains and stresses of this conflict of purposes between the new producing forces, active and imperative forces operating in the world's life to thrust leisure and plenty upon us, and an old distributive system whose essential and designed purpose is to deny both leisure and plenty to the working life of mankind. Let us be quite clear about this. You will altogether misunderstand the menace of this conflict of our civilization if you picture to it yourself simply as a conflict of opinion amongst men, and an occasion of strife between them, as to how these new powers should be handled. The disruptive conflict is in the actual impact of the new powers upon the world's life. In the actual economic and social consequences brought about, not by the controversies in which men may engage concerning them, but by their very presence and operation within a social structure designed for an age of scarcity, and in its very nature obstructive to their development and their normal working. Examine the facts and see. The new producing forces do not merely offer us leisure and plenty. They thrust leisure and plenty upon us. This is the law of their nature. In the matter of leisure, they relieve human labor of its old function as the physical energy of production, and give us our supplies by the new and vaster measure of the non-human powers which science has enslaved for our service. In an economic system adjusted to the new forces of production, that might be a general release of human life from incessant toil into a large degree of well-provisioned leisure and opportunity for wider human culture. On the other hand, in an economic system not so adjusted, an economic system which denies, as our present system does, any such right of leisure to the working life of the community and makes no provision for it, it becomes leisure thrust upon us as a problem of destitute unemployment, menacing civilization instead of advancing it. Whether we adjust our economic system to human leisure, and so put civilization in movement towards the general opportunities of a wider cultural life, which are implicit in the new producing forces, is a matter for human intelligence or stupidity to decide. But there is no choice for us concerning the leisure itself in one form or the other. It is thrust upon us as the necessary economic impact of the new producing forces upon our lives, quite apart from our opinions as to what should be done about it. It is also in the necessary consequences of the new producing forces that we have plenty thrust upon us. The output of every hour of human effort is multiplied anything up to the 1,000-fold what it was in the age of which our present system of ownership had its origins, and this, in any economic system adjusted to the new forces of production, might mean a general enrichment of life in proportion to the new abundance. Whether we do so adjust our economic system is, again, a matter for human intelligence or stupidity to decide. But in any case, the plentiful production is thrust upon us by the nature of the new forces. And if we take it within our present economic system, with ownership appropriating the surplus beyond the working maintenance of the world's labor, we find ourselves involved in the unspeakable confusions which have made this period of attempting to do it the period of confusions beyond all nightmares in the world's affairs. If you say so. For it is no longer the consumable surplus of an age of scanty resources, a surplus which ownership could use when it had taken it. It is the surplus of gigantic powers of production, and within such an economic system it becomes glut, congestion, overproduction, choking the commerce of the world through whose channels ownership has to attempt to dispose of it. Every commercial crisis in these circumstances is a crisis of what is described in ownership economics as overproduction. Not overproduction in relation to the world's needs, but overproduction in relation to the purchasing power which such an economic system distributes to its serfs and hirelings as their consuming ration of the wealth they produce so copiously. Hence follows the mad scramble for outside markets, the attempts to stake out commercial claims in the undeveloped countries of the world where the surplus can be unloaded, the development of such countries from customers into competitors, and all the arrangements and wars of the world to secure and retain markets. Civilization is still reeling from the shock of one world war brought about by all this, and is still keeping itself armed to the teeth in readiness for the next. Remember, this was written in 1931. You see, therefore, that the strains and conflicts now going on in the world's life and threatening a destruction of civilization itself are not simply a matter of the controversies men may carry on about the merits or demerits of an economic system, of discounts roused by agitation or deliberately incited social and industrial troubles. There are, as I have said, and as the facts show very clearly, the actual impact which the new forces make upon the economy of a world of private ownership, the inevitable collision of opposing purposes, whether we adjust our economics of distribution to the possibilities of the new age of plenty and production is, I again repeat, a matter for human intelligence or stupidity to decide. But whatever may be our disputations about that, or whatever form such disputation may take in social unrest and class struggles, the real menace to our civilization is that in any case the plenty is thrust upon us and becomes overproduction, commercial breakdowns, market congestion, bankruptcies, and in the final resort, war and the devastation of the world when it is thrust upon us within the economy of a social order which, by its very nature and design, handles it for the narrow purposes of a class society. The new forces in production cannot be handled for such restricted purposes. Without these disasters, and all our present confusions and distresses are but incidents in the clash of purposes between a producing system which can only work to ends of human leisure and plenty, and a system of ownership which can only function to obstruct the passage of leisure and plenty into the general life and to retain them for class usage and possession. And I think we'll stop there for part 2.